Hi, this is Mr. Adolph, and we're going to get started with our first unit in biology class, and that is going to be the Introduction to Biology, which leads us to the first question of what is biology, right? We all have heard that term before, but what does it actually mean? So let's take a second and define it. Bio is actually from the Greek philosophers, and it's a word bios, and it just means life. Now, you've probably heard ology before, right? You've heard of dermatology, you know, meteorology, anything ology, and that's a simple thing. It just means the study of. So it's really a Greek term, which means the study of life. So biology really is an extremely important thing to study because we're alive, right? We're living things, and we live in this on this planet which is full of living things, and we live with them and we have to work with them. So it's a really important area to study, in my opinion. So we've determined that biology is the study of life. So, all right, well, what is life? And that's a big question. Right? That I don't know that anybody has the answer to. Like, where did life come from? We don't really know that. But we know that something can be living and something's not living, right? So, for example, if I say, look around your room right now and find something that's living, well, you're living, right? But there's probably not a whole lot of other living things in there if you're in there by yourself. But then if you look a little harder and you start thinking about it, you'll probably start noticing, oh, wait a second, there's a plant over there. Or, oh, I just saw a bug fly and land. Or you probably have heard of bacteria before, right? So there's a lot of living things around you. You just might not really pay attention to them all the time. So what makes something living? Well, there's a bunch of characteristics of living things, and we're going to go through those right now. The first thing that all living things have in common is they're made up of something called cells. Now, we're going to talk about cells a lot in here. And a cell is basically, that's the unit of life. Everything that is living is made up of at least one cell. So they can really come in two forms. You can be unicellular or multicellular. So what does uni mean? Well, uni means one or a single, right? And multi means many. So a unicellular organism is made up of a single cell, or it's only one celled, and a multicellular organism is made up of many cells. We're obviously multicellular. We're actually made up of trillions of cells. And that's always so amazing to me because we're really a community of cells. That's what we are. We're made up of these trillions of cells, and they all work together to make your body run, which is so amazing to me. Now, a unicellular organism, that is just a single cell that is alive. So what are some examples of that? Well, if you look over here, you can see some examples, and you've probably heard of some of these. Bacteria, I know you've heard of, right? If you've ever been sick before, you might have taken an antibiotic, right? Anti means against, biotic means life. So antibiotics kill things, and in this case, bacteria. An amoeba you may have heard of before. If you've ever gone to Mexico before, you may know not to drink the water if you're not from there, right? Because it can make you very sick. It causes something called amoebic dysentery. That's because the water there have these little one-celled organisms in a lot of places called amoeba, and when your body if you ingest that, it'll actually cause some real problems in your body and you'll get very sick. So there's a bunch of different kinds of single-celled organisms. Actually, most organisms on this planet are single-celled. We just don't see them because they're so small that you can't see them with the naked eye. The next thing that makes something living is the ability to reproduce. And what that means is very simply to take one organism and make another one from it. And there's really two ways in which that can happen: through asexual reproduction or sexual reproduction. So you are a product of sexual reproduction. I'm sorry to tell you that, but at some point your parents had you, right? So two individuals formed a new one, and that's called sexual reproduction. It's when you have two organisms produce one or more new organisms. Asexual reproduction, on the other hand, is when one single organism splits into two or more. So, for example, bacteria is a great example of that. They go through asexual reproduction. So you can see here, you have your parent cell, so that's the first cell. It goes through a process called mitosis, which we're going to learn about this year, and it splits into two new cells. The asexual reproduction produces two identical cells that are exactly the same as the original cell. Sexual reproduction, on the other hand, produces a new cell, which is going to be different than the original. So, perfect example. Look at you, right? You don't look exactly the same as your parents. You look like them, but you don't look exactly the same. If you have a brother or a sister and you're not an identical twin, you don't look exactly the same. And that is because you're a product of two different organisms combining their traits to make a new one. So that is going to be asexual versus sexual reproduction. And then the next one, the next characteristic that makes something living is it's based on something called a universal genetic code. You've all seen this image before, right? That is called DNA. And every single one of your cells has a copy of DNA. And what that DNA is a genetic code. And that genetic code is what determines all of your traits. And we're going to talk a whole lot about DNA this year. I'm sure you're very aware of what it is, but we're going to go pretty deep into how it works and what it means. So in order for something to be living, it has to have some form of a genetic code. And that genetic code is what determines all of that organism's traits, and that's also what gets passed on during reproduction to the next generation. We're going to go over a couple more, and then we're going to stop the lecture for today. The next thing that makes something living is the ability to grow and develop, right? You started off as a little tiny baby. Actually, you started off as a single cell, right? Egg and sperm come together, you get a single cell, and then very quickly that cell replicates and it becomes 2 cells, 4 cells, 8, 16, 32, all the way up to the hundreds of thousands, and then pretty soon it's in the millions. And then you're a baby. And then over your life you grow and you continue to grow. Your cells are constantly replacing themselves. We're going to talk about this a lot this year, but one thing that I find very fascinating is every 7 years, every single cell in your body, except for your nerve cells and a couple other types, completely replace themselves. So you're a new human every 7 years or so. And that you can see here, this is an example of the development of a human, but this is true of any living organism. Even a bacteria cell is going to grow and develop over its life. Now, a lot of bacteria only lives hours to days, but in that short life, they do grow and they do develop. The next thing that makes something living is they have to be able to obtain and use materials for energy. Right about now, you're probably getting a little bit hungry because you've been thinking. And that's because anything your body does, including thinking, breathing, even sleeping takes energy. Everything that you do requires energy. So where do we get the fuel for that energy? We get it from our food and our nutrients. So that is called metabolism. Now, you've probably heard that term before. You might have even heard some people say they have a fast metabolism or a slow metabolism. And that does happen. But what is metabolism? Well, if you take a look here in this image, you can see it's taking in food to break down that food and convert that food to usable energy. So when you eat your lunch today, your body's going to digest that food, break it down into very small particles that your cells can absorb, and then your cells are going to use that fuel to make energy. And it's going to use that energy to go through all of the processes that a body goes through. So just a review of what we talked about today. Living things, biology is a study of life, and living things have many characteristics. And the first ones that I went over today are all living things are made of cells, and that could either be unicellular or multicellular. All living things can reproduce, and that can either be sexual or asexual, meaning one individual becomes two, or in sexual, two individuals make a new individual. And all living things are made of a universal genetic code, and we call that DNA, right? And we also talked about the fact that all living things are going to grow and develop. And then finally, all living things are going to take in some form of a material. For us, it's food. For plants, it's sunlight for energy. For some other microorganisms, they do other processes. But for the most part, all living things take in some form of material, energy, and they use that to create usable energy and convert it to usable energy in order to survive. Thanks so much, and we'll see you again at the next lecture.